Given its significant budgetary constraints, there were always going to be areas in which the Russian army lagged behind its Western competitors. The Russian Navy, for example, was never going to be up to United States Navy standards, nor were technologies like drones as mature in Russia as they were in places like the United States. But there are some fields in which the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation fielded some genuine world beaters, and today we're going to talk about one of those. We're going to talk about the family of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that collectively make up what the Russians would call long-range precision strike weapons. And before the February invasion, there was no family of Russian military capabilities that inspired greater fear and concern in Western observers than these precision strike weapons, the thousands of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that the Russians had at their disposal. When Russia went into Syria, it wasn't their tanks or artillery that they wanted to show off to the world. It was their capacity to launch cruise missiles from as far away as the Caspian Sea in order to engage precision targets in Syria. It was the frightening combination of stealthy, precise air-launched cruise missiles, relatively precise ground-launched ballistic missiles, and naval precision weapons like the Kalibr that really shaped thinking around the potential Russian threat. And so when the Russian invasion did begin in February, many Western observers expected it to begin with a barrage of hundreds of precision weapons, knocking out air defense systems, command and control, and critical infrastructure all across Ukraine, a shock and awe campaign that would rip away Ukraine's ability to coordinate and fight back. Instead, the opening Russian salvo was relatively ineffective. And the campaign has now deteriorated to the point where we see Soviet-era weapons with designs dating back to the 1960s being flung at urban areas only to impact things like shopping malls and civilian targets. There have still been some militarily significant strikes on Ukrainian targets, but there are likewise a slew of questions around the efficacy of this missile campaign and also its sustainability. So that's what I want to look at today. I'm going to open with a little bit of history. We're going to look at the history of Russian missile and rocket development and also how that has shaped their doctrine over time. We're going to look at the opposing rocket and missile forces, so the Russian and Ukrainian forces that were arrayed against each other at the time of the February invasion. Then we're going to look at the campaign itself, how both sides have used their rocket and missile weapons against each other in this campaign, and make some observations around their performance so far. Then we're going to look at sustainability. There have been articles in the media saying that Russia is about to run out of precision weapons basically since March, so we're going to look at that claim and investigate just how long the arsenal and the production supporting it can probably hold up under wartime conditions. And then, using the limited information available to us, we're going to try and draw some potential lessons that may be applicable to other nations that are observing this war. And I thought I'd start this one with a little bit of history and some insight into Russian doctrine, because while something like a helicopter or a tank is relatively intuitive for a Western audience to evaluate and understand, there is some history that underpins the different ways in which Russia think about rockets and missiles, how they've developed them, why they put emphasis on them, and how they use them today. And in telling that story, I think it's important to point out here at the start that the Russian Empire and after it the Soviet Union really has produced some phenomenal talent in the aerospace and rocketry fields. Some of the greatest minds that actually go on to serve in American aviation are individuals who are born within the borders of the Russian Empire. When you think of American helicopters, you think of Sikorsky. Sikorsky was born in the Russian Empire. When you think of advocates of the power of strategic aviation, you probably think of Alexander Desavsky, who convinced Walt Disney, of all people, to create an animated film in order to sell the American public on the concept of strategic bombing. I'm completely serious, by the way. It's a 1943 film called Victory Through Air Power. Next time someone in the family says throw on a Disney movie for the kids, give serious consideration to it if you want them to learn the benefits of destroying your opponent's industrial centers through the use of strategic aviation. And of course there's another Alexander Kartveli, who is a Georgian by birth but within the boundaries of the Russian Empire, and this is the man behind many of Republic Aviation, so some of American aviation's greatest hits, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Thunderjet, the Thunder Chiefs of the Vietnam War. This guy was behind some great designs. And then of course there were some minds that didn't leave, that stayed behind, which gave us generations of Soviet aircraft that are well known to this day to Western and foreign observers. Mikoyan, Gurevich, Tupolev, Sukhoi. And beyond aircraft designers, the Soviet Union was very fortunate when it came to rocketry talent as well. Among them, one name stands out: Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, who was born on the territory of what is now Ukraine and had a Belarusian mother. Now, research programs are always bigger than one man, but the USA had Goddard, the Soviet Union had Korolev, but it's not just a matter of having talent, it's a question of how you use it. The Soviet Union looked at this incredible talent and, of course, sent him immediately to a gulag. They released him later, though, and set him to work on the Soviet rocketry program. And that rocket program took off both figuratively and literally. In 1950, the Soviets were building copies of the German V2. In 1957, they were testing the world's first ICBM, the R-7, and launching Sputnik into orbit. When you think about the fact that it now regularly takes militaries a decade or more to design something as simple as a new tank, the fact that the Soviet Union went from copies of the V2 to orbit in less than 7 years is all the more impressive. It was stunning, meteoric development that would lead the Soviet Union to put the first man in space and win a number of early milestones in the space race. The USSR ploughed resources into rocketry research and missile development. The question is, why? And like so many things in the Soviet Union, there was a defense rationale behind it all, at least to a degree. The problem the Soviet Union, and to an extent even now the People's Republic of China, face when it contemplates armed competition with NATO forces, and particularly with the United States, is how do you deal with Western air power? In particular, how do you deal with the United States Air Force and the United States Navy's aviation capacity? You have to remember that the Soviet rocket program is really getting its start in a big way during the era where the United States is forming Strategic Air Command. And the Soviets look at the United States Air Force, and they look at the carrier capabilities of the United States Navy, and they figure out pretty capability that building up like with like, probably not practical. The sheer number of fighter aircraft you would need to contest American air superiority, the number of carriers, which the Soviet Union had none of at the time and America had dozens. So the Soviets looked to weapon systems that allow them to operate in an environment where the opponent probably has air superiority, or at least to take the edge off the power of the United States Navy's carrier force, and also the abilities of the United States Air Force and Strategic Air Command to attack targets in Soviet territory or on the territories of the Warsaw Pact. And overwhelmingly, they turned to missiles and rockets. They turned to surface-to-air missiles as a defensive solution against American aircraft. They turned to strategic missiles like ICBMs, IRBMs to deliver their nuclear weapons because they're not confident in the ability of their strategic bomber force to range out to the United States, penetrate NORAD, and destroy American targets that way. In terms of dealing with American carriers on the high sea, well, they turned to anti-ship missiles. If you look at Soviet-designed ships, you'll see very large tubes filling every square metre of the deck. They have very unclean lines in that sense compared to American vessels. Those are large, long-range anti-ship missiles. And the idea there is pretty simple. Take a long-range, heavy missile capable of sinking a carrier and launch dozens and dozens of the things from very long range, preferably beyond the range of the carrier's air groups, and destroy American carriers that way. Launch all the missiles, then run. And then for battlefield and operational work, you had a range of surface-to-surface missiles. Scuds, frogs, names that would become familiar to a generation of Western observers. Originally, these were mostly designed to deliver nuclear warheads into the operational depths of the enemy. Russia has refined those weapon systems into a way to deliver conventional destruction against precision or area targets, even though they may not have air superiority. But it was that thinking that led the Soviet Union to, at the time of its breakup, have some of the most formidable rocket and missile forces on the planet. The army had thousands of surface-to-surface missiles, some of which would pass into the hands of Ukraine and ultimately be used in 2022. The Navy was packed with hulls that were designed to fit as many large anti-ship missiles as possible, and most of the nuclear weapons sat with the strategic rocket forces, which were considered prestigious enough to be their own independent arm. And almost all of these systems were designed to be capable of carrying nuclear warheads. So the next time you see a media article out there saying that you should panic because Russia has deployed nuclear-capable missiles or nuclear-capable artillery systems to whatever location, just remember that that headline could easily just read, Russia deploys damn near any weapon in its arsenal to said location. The weapon systems are almost all nuclear capable. It's the warheads that are separately stored and tracked and only brought forward if something serious is about to go down. Just thought I'd insert that note. But with the history aside, the question then becomes, how does Russia conceive of these weapons? How does Russia intend to use these weapons in line with its doctrine? Now, because Russia isn't kind enough to publish its 2022 era manuals, I've once again turned to TC 7-100.2 Opposing Force Tactics to try and get an understanding of how Russian doctrine thinks about things like surface-to-surface missiles. This doctrine, this thinking, is something we're going to use to frame and understand our observations about how these missiles have been used in Ukraine as we go through this presentation. The first thing to say is that Russia integrates surface-to-surface missiles with other sources of fire, so things like airstrikes, for example. They're designed to hit targets in line with strategic and operational goals in cooperation with other weapon systems. And that can mean a variety of missions. So, for example, surface-to-surface missiles are mentioned as part of the SEAD mission, the Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses mission. So you might see Russia firing things like Iskander missiles against Ukrainian air defenses, which indeed we have seen. Wherever you might see Russian forces use an airstrike, you could equally see Russian forces use a surface-to-surface missile if that is the asset that is available and it is appropriate to service the target. Russia doesn't regard surface-to-surface missiles or things like this as particularly special. They're just another tool that is available to commanders to effect target destruction. Keep that in mind as we're going through how Russia has used these weapon systems in Ukraine so far. So with that background out of the way, let's have a look at the balance of forces. What did Russia have available to it? What did Ukraine have available to it before the Russians made the decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022? We've talked a lot about why the Soviets put emphasis on rockets, but what does the modern Russian arsenal actually look like? It's important to acknowledge that the Russians entered this conflict with some genuinely world-class systems in inventory, many of which they had recently tested in Syria. I can't go through all of them, but there's a couple of key examples here. In terms of ground-based systems, there's the famous Iskander. There's a big fight over how many launches the Russians have. Wikipedia and the other sources are in deep disagreement over just how many launch systems they have. Wikipedia claims more than 400 and posts overwhelmingly Russian news articles. Military Balance 2021 claimed a lower figure of about 200 systems. But this is a relatively modern system. 2006 was the year of introduction, 400 to 500 kilometer range minimum, and a circular error probable of 10 meters. Remember, that means that half of the missiles fired will land within a 10-meter distance of the aiming point. Iskander already caused some concern in Western observers leading up to this conflict, but it's also unveiled certain capabilities during it that, at least in open source, we didn't know it had. So, for example, we've seen evidence of these missiles deploying penetration aids, so distractions, little tools that are designed to confuse enemy defenses into thinking the little decoys are also missiles and tricking enemy air defenses into engaging them and being unable to engage the real missile. Then there are some quite modern air launch systems as well. KH-101, this is a very, very, very extensive modernization of the old KH-55, introduced in 2012. It's designed to have stealth characteristics. I've got an image of one up there on the top right. Very, very long range, 5,000 kilometers. So they can fire these things and have fired these things at Syria from the Caspian Sea. And after that distance, it has a CEP of about 10 meters and a very large warhead. So quite a formidable weapon system all round. And then there's Russia's vaunted hypersonic weapons. Now, Russia does have some serious hypersonic capabilities in development. The Avangard, the Zircon, but the one they fired in Ukraine is the KH-47, and this is basically a way to meet the brief of designing a hypersonic weapon without designing a hypersonic glide vehicle. Basically what they did was they took a modified Iskander missile, or bits of an Iskander missile, which is already hypersonic because it's a bloody rocket. They strapped it to a supersonic aircraft like a MiG-31 Foxhound, and then you fire the rocket from the aircraft and say, woohoo, I have a hypersonic weapon. Like, congratulations, you could have just shot the rocket from the ground and achieved the same basic result, but more power to you. It is, however, a formidable weapon. It is hard for air defenses to intercept because the thing is going so bloody quickly, but then again, it's also really, really hard to stop Iskander. And then there's the weapon system that has something none of those other missiles have, and that's good publicity. The Kalibr missile is the tiger tank of missiles when it comes to the Ukraine war. You'll notice that the media likes to attach one name to all weapon systems of a certain type. All German tanks in World War II are Tigers. Every anti-tank missile in Ukraine is a Javelin, every Manpads is a Stinger, and every cruise missile is a Kalibr. The Kalibr missile is a real prestige piece for the Russian military. It is so important that some have coined the term or used the term calibrization for the Russian Navy to describe the pattern whereby the Russian submarine force and surface force is increasingly being modified to basically just be launch platforms for Kalibr missiles. They used an awful lot of these things in Syria when they were assisting Bashar al-Assad, including, frankly, against targets that probably didn't need to be hit with cruise missiles because they wanted to show off that they could and because they wanted to practice their employment, or at least that seems to have been the reasoning. Now, like so many other high-tier, high-performance Russian systems, the weakness really is production rate. The production rate for the Kalibr isn't bad. I've seen estimates that range between 50 and 200 missiles per year, with the midpoint usually being about 100 to 120 missiles per year. That's actually okay, but it's certainly not enough to build up a large stockpile for a force which is trying to rely on this as its main precision strike tool. But, who cares about stockpiles when you have amazing publicity? And the Kalibr had some pretty impressive publicity. And of course, this capability doesn't come cheap. Weapon systems like Kalibr or Iskander, well, they come in at millions of dollars per shot. And then there's all the older stuff, because Russia, like the Soviet Union, is really reluctant to throw stuff away. They've got many, many thousands of older missiles in service and available to them as well, some of which we've seen in Ukraine. Now, some of those, to be fair, are relatively serviceable. Kh-59, Kh-55, these are weapons from the 1980s. They're not particularly accurate. They've got circular error probables stated of between 10 and 25 meters, which means you're probably going to miss, but you're not going to miss by that much. But then they're also using weapon systems that are positively ancient and probably aren't that serviceable. There were about 3,000, I believe, Kh-22s manufactured in the Soviet Union. This thing was a standoff munition that was originally designed to go out and hit US carrier groups with a nuclear warhead. Now, as you might gather, a weapon system which is designed to find something the size of an aircraft carrier against a flat ocean probably doesn't have the best guidance system and radar and detection capabilities when it comes to finding individual buildings amongst a sea of buildings. Now, depending on the model and the guidance mode and the target type, this thing's got a circular error probable of anywhere between 200 meters and 5 kilometers, which is not exactly a precision weapon. And these air launch systems are augmented by ground launch systems like the Tochka-U, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we look at the Ukrainian forces in a moment. And then there's essentially a third category of missile in the Russian arsenal. These ones I'm going to call the Improvised. These are not technically ground attack missiles, but they're missiles that the Russians have pushed into service to attack ground targets. We've seen them use both anti-aircraft missiles, so things like S-300, fitting them with GPS receivers, and using them to attack ground targets. We've also seen extensive use of the Onyx missile, which is a supersonic anti-ship missile, being used to hit ground targets. Now, this is often used as evidence of the fact that Russia is running out of things like Kalibr and Iskander. I'm not so sure for two reasons. The first is the Russians practiced firing Onyx missiles out of what's called the Bastion coastal defense system. It's a missile launcher packing a bunch of Onyx missiles that's designed to protect Russian shores from NATO vessels. Well, they practice firing missiles from these systems at ground targets in Syria. I'm not sure why you would practice that if it counts as rank improvisation and is a desperation measure. Personally, I'm convinced it's a little more nuanced than that. For one thing, the Russians already practiced firing Onyx missiles from Bastion P against ground targets in Syria. You'd think if it was a desperation measure they wouldn't practice doing it, especially not when Onyx missiles come in at more than $1 million per shot. But the Onyx is, when fired from Bastion, relatively accurate, it seems, when engaging ground targets, so it makes sense that if it is the only weapon in the field that can respond in a certain time, maybe you do use Onyx to engage ground targets. And then you worry about who's going to explain the build to the general later on. Using S-300 in the ground attack role seems a little more desperate. It's not quite as precise in the ground attack role as something like Onyx, but then again the Russians have a lot of S-300 missiles. So there may be some thinking there, but basically goes, why not use them in their secondary function, considering we probably don't need them in order to engage the Ukrainian Air Force. So what I take away from this is while it might not be particularly efficient to throw anti-ship missiles at ground targets or to fire anti-aircraft missiles at apartment buildings, the missiles do seem to have been designed with this capability in mind, at least in the case of Onyx. The Russians seem to have practiced this in Syria, so we shouldn't be particularly surprised when we see it happening. Now, in terms of these missiles, Ukraine certainly entered the war with a less formidable arsenal than Russia, but by European standards, a pretty formidable one. They had 99 K-79 Tochka-U missile systems. This is a late Soviet system, and they had about 500 missiles for those launches. Now, those missiles did see some significant use in the early stages of the war, and then the Ukrainians started to be very conservative in their use while they waited for HIMARS to arrive, because for a period of time while they waited for those reinforcements, this was the only system they had that could reach out behind the lines and destroy targets in operational depths. Now, since HIMARS arrived, the Ukrainians have been seemingly more willing to fire these things off in large numbers, but they're probably an endangered species in the Ukrainian army because resupply is going to be very, very difficult. In terms of Western allies who have significant stocks of Tochka missiles, I can really only think of Bulgaria as a ready source of resupply, though there may be others out there. Instead now, quite famously, Ukraine is basically relying on GLMRS rockets, 227mm rockets for the HIMARS or the M270 MLRS systems, to do what Tochka-U's job was before, which is to strike into the enemy operational depths, destruction of enemy command posts, destruction of ammunition depots. Those are the sort of jobs we've been seeing HIMARS do. But it's not really a perfect substitution. In some ways, these guided 227mm rockets are much superior to Tochka. They're much more precise. If you watch the videos of the strikes on things like the Antonovsky Bridge or strikes on some of these ammunition depots, multiple rockets land on a dime, smacking into the target point. Tochka doesn't have that precision. But the limit is warhead size and range. These rockets only have a range of about 80 kilometers, and the warhead is considerably smaller than Tochka, which means the Ukrainians are struggling with long-distance targets that they can't reach out to, famously like the Kerch Bridge, and with targets that are very heavily engineered that require many strikes from HIMARS, when maybe one Tochka rocket would do comprehensive demolition work on the target, things like reinforced bridges. Now, quite early on in this war, one of my presentations featured a slide on the need to transition Ukraine over to NATO standard equipment. On that slide, I used two examples of weapon systems that they would need to be trained on. Howitzers, the M777 was the example I used right at the time that they were being announced, was the example of a system they could learn quickly, which would give them an interim capability, artillery. But the other image I put up there was of something I thought they'd need to eventually transition into. And that's the Army Tactical Missile System, ATACMS, because that's a weapon system that has a longer range and a large unitary warhead that is capable of demolishing these reinforced targets. It's a weapon system capable of doing the job that Tochka was meant to do and the job that Iskander does for the Russians. Now, so far, America has held back from supplying these weapons because they have the range to hypothetically reach into Russia. But in terms of natural evolutions for Ukrainian capability, one would think ATACMS should be on the agenda with an agreement from the Ukrainians that they will not be used to strike into Russia. That's just an observation on my part though. So far, as I said, America has refrained from supplying these sort of missile systems to Ukraine. But they would be a more like-for-like comparison to the old Tochka system that Ukraine has been using up to this point. So those were the respective arsenals of Russia and Ukraine going into this crisis. How have both sides utilised their weapon systems in the war so far? So many Western commentators expected a very large Russian missile strike to be basically the opening salvo of the invasion. Shock and awe, essentially, in the American style, with a very large salvo of cruise and ballistic missiles being launched. Instead, the opening hours of that first critical day, and indeed the second and third days, did feature Russian missile strikes, the primary targets being air bases and air defence installations. But there were some important caveats. The first was, while Russia was deploying some of its most modern weapon systems, it was using them in lower numbers than many observers had expected. The second point was it didn't really seem to achieve its desired goal. Ukrainian air defences survived the initial bombardment, and many airfields were not put out of action by the initial rocket barrage. There was no shock and awe. There was no knockout blow which paralysed command centres, decision-making capabilities, cell phone networks survived. All the critical infrastructure was basically untouched by the initial bombardment. And here I want to make a personal observation. I know there are still a lot of people out there who do not subscribe to the idea that Russia did plan a quick war. They think that Russia was launching a feint towards Kyiv, and the idea was always to launch a grinding campaign in the Donbass or in the south. To me, and this is just my analysis, the fact that Russia didn't go all out in destroying critical Ukrainian infrastructure in the first days of the war suggests to me that they did think it was going to be a relatively easy, relatively quick affair. The Ukrainians were never going to be more vulnerable than they were in the opening hours of the invasion, and when it comes to fixed targets like known government command centres, power plants, cell phone towers, and critical utilities exchanges, train lines and train stations, warehouses, these are all fixed targets that the Russians should have known about before the conflict started. To me, if they had always been planning a grinding war, they probably would have prioritised more of those targets for destruction in the opening hours. Nonetheless, we did see some impressive precision strikes and many uses of Russia's most advanced systems from the very first day of the conflict. Now, by March, I think the Russian command has figured out that everything is not going according to plan and the Ukrainians are not going to roll over, and as a result there is an escalation in missile attacks and something of a change in target set. You see this transition where the Russians start hitting oil infrastructure, fuel storages. In Dnipro, in Odessa, in Lviv, in March and April, you see multiple long-distance missile strikes, and there's an immediate impact on the availability of fuel for the Ukrainian civilian population, and presumably a logistical impact on the Ukrainian army as well. You also see a wider range of targets in terms of warehouses and storages being targeted, and also factories and parts of the military-industrial complex being targeted, which weren't really destroyed in the early days, again, possibly because Russia intended to leave those industries intact and either make use of them after the war or leave them intact for whatever Ukrainian regime came after the current one. In terms of weapon systems, though, this is still precision strikes mostly. It's Iskander, it's Kalibr, and it's Onyx missiles fired from Bastion. So more of the same from the opening days, but with a wider target set and just more application of these relatively advanced precision munitions. Even Mariupol, in the early stages of that battle, was mostly being struck by guided munitions when it came to airstrikes, and also some surface-to-surface missiles. Then, slowly, observers started to notice a change in the weapon mix being used. Russia opened the war firing its most modern and its best, and it augmented those attacks with an increasing number of airborne cruise missile attacks. Initially, these were again quite accurate weapon systems being used, some from relatively short ranges, others being launched very long range from places like Belarus. By May, however, we start to see KH-22s, or apparent KH-22s being used. This is a missile system from the 60s, not the 80s, this is from the 1960s. And yes, there are some later models and some modernizations, but this is not an accurate weapon system, with circular error probable measured in the hundreds of meters. And in May, we saw these things being fired in Donetsk Oblast. We also saw 8-12 being fired at Kremenchuk. We saw one hit the Palace of Culture in Lozova. We saw more fired in Donetsk. These are some examples of strikes apparently involving KH-22s that I was able to draw from various media sources. And it's important to stress here, it's not just Ukrainian sources being used here, it's not just the wreckage of these missiles that we're recovering, it's not just video evidence of the missiles being fired, it's the Russians themselves releasing video of their strategic bombers carrying these weapons and firing them in the direction of Ukraine. So just like you see the Russian army start to roll out older and older reserve hardware, the Russian aviation forces start rolling out the museum pieces, the KH-22s, because 3,000 of these bloody things were made, they've got them in storage, they're available, they've got very large warheads, they're devastating, the only problem is that they're not particularly accurate. You also see them begin to be used in mixed attacks with more modern weapon systems. And here the rationale might be the penetration of air defences. If you've got an attack where you've got a whole bunch of KH-22s, yeah, sure, they may not hit the target, but they might soak up Ukrainian surface-to-air missile fire and Ukrainian air defence activity to allow the more precision weapons to strike. So we've been seeing these things mixed in with Kalibr and other weapon systems as well. But the use of these weapon systems really does make me want to raise a quick question around targeting. This guy here is Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov. Konashenkov is the spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Defense and the person who gives the daily update on the progress of their so-called special military operation in Ukraine. For those of you out there who have listened to every single one of Konashenkov's daily briefings, you'll know that he has a few favourite phrases, ones that the Russians really like including in their press releases. And the one I want to call out here is that Konashenkov loves saying that things were destroyed using precision weapons. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, they do not target civilian targets, and they mostly use precision weapons in order to destroy opposing military hardware. That claim isn't really in line with what we know about Russian doctrine. TC 7-100.2 talks about how in Russian doctrine, surface-to-surface missiles will be used to attack targets in the homeland of an opponent. Now, that may be done in order to limit access by destroying transportation networks, it might be used to destroy lines of communication, or it will be used to attack vulnerable parts of the enemy's combat systems, which includes strikes on infrastructure and even civilian targets, quote. The manual also notes, and here's the interesting point, because we're going to talk about what the Russians have done in a moment, it notes that such opposing force attacks will be coordinated with perception management efforts to convey the view that these terror tactics are no worse than enemy bombing campaigns. In other words, even back in 2011, we expected that if the Russians went to war, they would attack civilian infrastructure in order to undermine their opponent's capacity to resist, and then they'd try and engage in media-shaping efforts to justify those attacks. Konashenkov and the Russian MOD basically use 4 canned rebuttals to deal with accusations that they're engaging in attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilian targets. The first is to claim that they didn't do it, that Ukraine is bombing itself. The second is to deny an attack ever happened. The third is to claim the attack was just a miss or an accident. And the fourth is to say, well, maybe we blew it up, but whatever Ukraine does is worse. This is where you see the, oh, but Ukraine was shelling the Donbass forever claim, which I will visit at some point. It's beside the point for the moment. For my part, I just want to focus for a moment on the claim that they use primarily precision weapons, and also that they do not target civilian infrastructure. Now, in rebutting those claims, I admit it is impossible to speak to every attack that Russia has seemingly launched on a civilian target. It's just not possible. But what we can do is prove that in at least some cases they have lied. For one example is the first March strike in Kharkiv. The Russians originally claimed when this building was hit that it wasn't them, that the Ukrainians were bombing themselves, and those of you who were following the news at the time probably remember this happening in the first days of March. The problem for this claim is the image that I've got on the top right there, which is from a video feed which captured the missile striking the target, and you can clearly see there, it's a Kalibr. Now that's a problem for Russia, firstly because Ukraine doesn't have the Kalibr, NATO countries don't have Kalibrs. The only other countries that have the thing are India, Vietnam, China, Iran, and Algeria. So unless there is some Algerian false flag stuff going down here, that is a Russian missile striking the target. The second point is that if Kalibr is as accurate as the Russians claim, then it shouldn't be a miss. This is a clearly intended strike. Now, there are other claims that Russia could have used to defend this incident. They could have claimed, for example, the building was full of military hardware or was being used for military purposes or some other things that would make it a legitimate target, but they didn't. They instead claimed they didn't launch the attack, which is clearly a lie based on the evidence that you have in front of you. And then there's the attack on the Kremenchuk Mall. I'm not interested in the claims of the various pro-Russian English speakers out there on Reddit. I'm interested in what the Russians specifically claimed about this attack that blew up a shopping centre and an awful lot of civilians. Now, the official line from Konashenkov, the spokesman for the Russian MOD, was that Russia launched a high-precision strike against a nearby machine plant which caused a fire to spread which destroyed the shopping centre. That's the official Russian claim that Konashenkov put out soon after the attack. 2 problems. Firstly, that's an image of a missile hitting the mall, not the other missile which hit the machine plant. That's a missile hitting the mall and blowing up. The second point is that is either a KH-22 or it's a KH-32. KH-32 is a modernized version of the 22 that was officially adopted in 2016 and has had a relatively limited production run. So it's probably a 22, but it could be a 32, we can't tell from that image. Either way, this is a 5-ton missile with a 500 kilo to 1-ton warhead. It's also a weapon system with precision that ranges from bad to abysmal depending on what exact missile it is. Now, to my mind, when you take a weapon system that is a coin flip on whether it lands within several hundred meters of your target, and you fire that at a point objective inside a city, well, you might claim you're not targeting civilian infrastructure, but you're certainly being bloody reckless, and you know full well what you're doing. Firing a weapon system like that at a city means that you know the risk and you willingly take it. So with that happy topic covered, let's jump over to some performance observations about the way that Russian and Ukrainian rockets and missile systems have performed during the war so far. And here there are 3 main observations that I want to pull out before we talk about specific lessons. Now, looking at the various articles that have raised the figure that about 60% of Russian missiles allegedly fail to reach their targets, the claim basically goes, according to anonymous sources in the US government, that about 20% of these missiles fail to launch properly, 20% suffer in-flight failure, and then 20% suffer some sort of major targeting failure, which gives you your overall 60% figure. And apparently it does vary by system. I want to stress here that it's impossible to verify this claim because we do not have Russian BDA data, and we don't have the data on all the strikes that they have apparently launched. So I advise caution when we evaluate this one. Now, there is evidence of some failures. We have dud missiles landing, we have booster sections from missiles that do not appear to have been hit by missiles landing in Ukraine and being recovered. We've got hits into empty fields and areas by missiles that seem to have landed intact. Well, not landed intact, that seem to have hit and detonated rather than being shot down. Obviously, unless the Russians particularly hated that particular patch of grass or wheat, they probably didn't intend to fire a precision munition at it, so that's probably a miss. and we're seeing larger and larger salvo sizes from the Russians. This may be partly in response to Ukrainian air defense, or it may be come down to the doctrine of how you guarantee target destruction. You see, commanders, when they're deciding how many weapons to task to a particular target, will do it based on how many weapons they need to send in order to achieve a certain probability of a certain outcome on the target. So if the Russians were assessing that their weapons were failing, we would expect them to start firing more weapons at individual targets in order to achieve the target or desired probability of a kill. But again, it's hard to differentiate between more weapons being fired for that reason and more weapons being fired in order to saturate air defences. In any case, this is a very, very interesting claim, because if it's true, it points to serious failures in the manufacturing and quality control space. Russian missiles aren't cheap. Kalibr is probably more expensive than Tomahawk. Iskander costs several $1 million, Onyx costs more than $1 million when you account for the conversions. So these weapon systems should be built to largely Western standards when you compare the costs to their Western equivalents. A 60% failure rate would never be tolerated in a NATO military. Never, at least in modern times. So if this turns out to be true, it raises questions over the quality of the production and quality assurance process. It would seem to suggest that while Russia is capable of designing very advanced munitions, it may not be up to the task of quality assuring those weapons before they go into service. And as a military handicap, that's immense. Because if you think there is a 60% chance that your weapon doesn't do what it is meant to do, then even if the enemy takes no action whatsoever, your need for how many of those weapons you need to fire goes up massively. At a 10% failure rate, one weapon gives you a 90% probability of destruction, which means you probably only need to send one weapon. You can get 99% by firing two. At a 60% failure rate, in order to break below that 10% chance of not destroying the target, you need to fire 5 missiles at the target instead of 1. And it gets very ugly if you're trying to achieve a 99% probability of a kill. And even the rumour of failure rates like that is probably going to be a real problem for Russian foreign arms sales going into the future. And the next thing to point out is the Russians do seem to have had some difficulty with targeting and accuracy during this campaign. Now, there have been some painful and notable hits by Russian missile forces against Ukrainian targets. There have been a number of training bases that we have confirmed hit. There have been some warehouses that are confirmed hit, and a number of strategic targets that have been struck throughout the campaign. But thousands of missiles have been fired. And from the video and photographic evidence available to us, it does seem like an awful lot of Russian missiles have struck empty fields or civilian targets with no apparent military value. And to be clear here, I'm talking about targets where both sides have unambiguously agreed that there was no underlying military value. This is not a case of Russia claiming a building was being used to store weapons and Ukraine saying no it wasn't. This is not a case of Russia putting up a video of a missile hitting the second floor of an apartment building and claiming that it was destroying a HIMARS system. These are instead the situations where the Russians do things like claim they didn't hit the target at all, we know they in fact hit it, and that it was a civilian target which caused civilian casualties. Now, there are essentially two options here. Either Russian weapon systems and targeting processes are insufficient and as a result they hit civilian targets, or they are deliberately lobbing weapons with an intention of hitting civilian targets. Now, while the latter is entirely possible, it does seem difficult to comprehend that Russia would employ its limited arsenal of long-range missiles and rockets against targets that do not have inherent military value, especially when striking those targets doesn't seem to undermine Ukrainian civilian morale, does seem to lead to a reaction from many countries across the rest of the world, and there doesn't seem to be any underlying military utility there. If you fire a multi-million-dollar missile and you destroy an apartment building and kill a number of civilians, that's a tragedy. It's a human tragedy that we cannot forget as we observe this war. But from a military perspective, it achieves basically nothing. It depletes a limited and valuable resource in order to destroy a target with no inherent military value. And so while there may have been some cases where terror is the goal of firing the weapon in question, I think the evidence does point to most of these hits on civilian targets being a result of very poor targeting, intelligence, or technical capability on the Russian side, as opposed to a deliberate effort to destroy that particular apartment building or that particular mall. To add to this, the responsiveness of the Russian targeting system seems to be limited from what we've seen so far. For one, we haven't really seen any confirmed cases of Russia using its standoff munitions, like, for example, Kalibr, in order to engage moving targets, which is a real limiting factor when you're trying to do things like interdict supply routes. And it's compounded by an apparent issue with responsiveness in the Russian targeting system. And what do I mean by this? What am I talking about here? Two observations. Firstly, the Russians will often launch a missile strike against a particular target. The target will not be destroyed, but a follow-up strike might take days to arrive. This suggests to me that the loop between doing BDA on the target to determine the effectiveness of the first strike to requesting and organising a follow-up strike is not exactly the most agile process in the universe. Indeed, it seems to be taking days in some cases. Now, where the specific problem in that process is, whether it takes them too long to get battle damage assessment done, whether it takes too long to get approvals up the chain, we don't know where exactly the weakness is in that process. But what we do know is the time to a repeat strike on a non-destroyed target is often very, very long. The second point is Russians often seem to fire based on outdated information. So that is, they will engage a target that several days before, or indeed several weeks before, had been used at one time to house military equipment or a military unit, but which was verifiably empty for days by the time a strike finally arrived. Now again, this could be intelligence failure, this could be reconnaissance failure, or it could just be that an original request for fire or a strike takes so long to move up the approval chain, be organised and actually be launched, that by the time it is launched, the targeting information is outdated. Now, from a civilian perspective, that's obviously a tragedy because you end up with a structure with no military value that belongs to someone or has some significance to someone being destroyed. Maybe some civilians lose their life, but from a military perspective, those strikes are utterly wasteful. And it does stand in pretty stark contrast to the use of specific weapons by the Ukrainians in a far more agile and responsive fashion. Now, Ukraine doesn't have weapons like Kalibr or Onyx or Iskander available to it. Instead, what Ukraine has been using for its strikes into operational depths is basically been the 227mm guided rockets of the HIMARS and the M270 GMLRS systems. Now, these rockets with a range of about 80 kilometers, a little bit further, have been used to strike things like ammunition depots and command centers primarily, and they're very, very good at engaging targets like that. For one thing, the weakness of the 227mm rocket is that it's got a relatively small warhead. But things like ammunition depots, you don't really need the biggest warhead on the planet because you're targeting, well, explosives. And if you hit it with enough energy and you do manage to touch off the munitions, the whole thing tends to go boom in a spectacular fashion. You don't need a KH-22 and a 1-ton HE warhead in order to blow that sucker up. But these systems have also likewise revealed certain limitations and why they can't be used as a complete one-for-one replacement with the sort of weapons that Russia has been using, like Iskander. And that's namely that against hardened targets, well-engineered targets, things like bridges, their 227mm rockets just do not pack enough punch. It took several days of concerted precision firing in order to put the Antonovsky Bridge out of service. And even then, the bridge hasn't been destroyed or blasted apart. It's just been holed, pockmarked, and one of the supports has been undermined, which means the bridge will require significant repairs. Something like an Iskander detonating on that bridge would have blasted a significant section of that thing apart and potentially, depending on where it landed, destroyed a support entirely. The other problem, of course, has been range. These things can only reach out about 80 plus kilometers, which means that now that Russia has adapted by moving many of its ammunition depots out of range and further away from the front, GMLRS is not the answer that it once was. So we can make the observation overall that the Ukrainians have been pretty effective in using these rocket systems to service a certain family of targets, HQs, ammunition depots, etc. But it's not a perfect substitute for longer range weapon systems with much larger warheads. And at least part of this success, I suspect, is not just the increased precision of the system or the ability of these rockets to penetrate air defense systems because they're small, fast, etc. It's because I suspect Ukrainian intelligence gathering and ISR is just superior. They have the advantage of their own people in the occupied territories who are willing to feed them intelligence, and they also have the advantage of, American drones and NATO intelligence gathering assets that are doing circles over the Black Sea or constantly doing satellite reconnaissance passes that can feed them information to help inform targeting. There has been no official confirmation on the exact extent to which that is happening, but the capability certainly is there. In any case, regardless of the specific performance characteristics of the Russian missile campaign so far, there is a question over how long they can sustain it. The first articles claiming that Russia was running out of long-range precision weapons basically started to appear in late April, from my recollection, and they've been a constant feature ever since. And the gulf between commentators only seems to have increased with time. Spend enough time on the internet and you will inevitably find English-speaking pro-Russian commentators saying that Russia is successfully and will continue to successfully interdict all weapons arms shipments into Ukraine by using long-range precision weapons in order to destroy them as they come across the border. These commentators have claimed multiple HIMARS systems destroyed, that the M777s never really crossed the border, that the Slovakian S-300 was destroyed within days of arriving in Ukraine, etc., etc. Now, many of those claims are of course provably false because we later see the weapon systems alleged to have been destroyed appearing on the front line and doing work later on. But the point stands. The hope, the idea behind these commentators is that it's going to be long-range precision weapons that are Russia's answer to the continued flow of weapons and systems across the Polish-Ukrainian border. And on the flip side, there are those pro-Ukrainian commentators that have been for months now basically saying that any day now Russia's going to run out of these weapons. And yet, as the days pass, the number of missiles fired doesn't really seem to decrease. In fact, July had some days where there were more than 30 missiles fired in a single day. So I think it really is worth stopping and looking at the evidence behind this claim for a moment. Is Russia running on empty, or have they embraced their inner Khrushchev and have been pumping rockets and missiles out like sausages? I think there are three components of trying to answer this question using the evidence that we have available to us. The first question is, how many missiles and rockets did they have available to them before the war broke out in February? The second thing is, what does their usage patterns tell us about where they may or may not be in terms of stockpile depletion? And thirdly, how quickly can they replace the weapons that they have fired? What is Russian production capacity when it comes to things like Iskander and Kalibr? Now, the Russians aren't big on stockpile disclosures and transparency, so finding good open source numbers on Russian stockpiles is sometimes difficult. But as long as you're willing to put pretty large error bars around your estimate, I think 7,000 is a relatively good start. Now, in terms of how that breaks down between the various systems, again, this is kind of difficult. Our best estimate is they produced something like 3,000 Kh-22s during the Soviet era, but a lot of those are hopefully been retired because they're utterly ancient, although who knows, given the Russians. And if you look at the structure of missile brigades now, you end up with numbers of maybe 700 Iskanders being operationally deployed, plus whatever they had in stockpile. If you're after a very, very rough estimate, I would draw a line down the center of that number and say about half of that stuff is relatively modern and half of that stuff is Soviet era and ancient. Now, if you take that stockpile number and you compare it to the number of rockets and missiles that Russia has fired into Ukraine, which is quite substantial, you see that there is some grounds to suggest depletion. By late May, the US was estimating that Russia had fired at least 1,100 missiles into Ukraine since the invasion, and Ukraine was already estimating 2,100. And the campaign hasn't really let up since then. June and July both had some days of very high levels of missile attacks. The Ukrainians, for example, claimed that about 200 missiles were fired into Ukrainian-controlled territory just in the second half of June. So if you compare those usage statistics with our 7,000 estimate, you end up with the conclusion that Russia probably isn't out of precision weapons, but it certainly is running through them frighteningly fast. But there's also the more specific question of what sort of rockets and missiles are they using? How has that changed over time? Because in the opening stages, the vast majority of strikes were being made with Kalibr, with Iskander, and with Onyx. They were engaging targets using their precision systems, their best systems, the top-of-the-line ones. Over time, you look at June, July, and now early August, and we're seeing more and more of the Soviet crap starting to surface. Not just the serviceable 1980s missiles, but more and more of these 1960s design era Kh-22s. Now, I've seen some arguments to suggest that maybe Russia is just employing their older weapons, not because they're running out of the new ones, but because, the old ones are cheaper and they're just trying to get rid of them. Problem is, those old weapon systems are nowhere near as effective as the newer ones. If you're going to miss your target by several hundred meters on average, you're going to need to fire an awful lot of missiles in order to reliably destroy your target. And while you could likewise also argue that they're being used to distract Ukrainian air defenses, the most modern Russian cruise missiles, the 101, is meant to be a stealth weapon that's capable of penetrating air defenses. It can fly extremely low and has a very small radar cross-section, as well as being incredibly precise. So I would tend to think, and here I agree with the UK Defence Journal, that if Russia is trotting out these older and older weapon systems, it's not because they're the best weapons for the job, it's because they're increasingly cautious about depleting their remaining stockpile of the most precise kinds. If Russia began the war with about half its stockpile made up of modern weapons, it overwhelmingly used them in the opening stages, and has fired about half of its total missile stockpile, then it stands to reason that they're probably starting to run short of the weapons, the top grade weapons that they had stockpiled at the beginning of this conflict. So then the question becomes, okay, if they haven't run out, but they've run through most of their stockpile, how quickly are they producing them? How quickly can they replace them? And here I've primarily relied on figures from the Centre for European Policy Research. I'll put a link in the sources, and I've tried to triangulate that with other sources as well. But as always, the problem is Russia isn't big on disclosing production figures. Now, according to the data that was gathered by SEPA, a number of plants in Russia do seem to have moved to a wartime production standing. So the Novator plant, which was producing the Kalibr missile at a rate of about 100 to 120 per year, that plant is now running triple shifts, which should correlate with about a 20% increase in production rate. Votkinsk, which was producing the Iskander, now that had been on a relatively low-rate production schedule. It was only running about 4 days per week. It's now on a surge production schedule, which aims to lift production from about 50 Iskander missiles a year to 60 Iskander missiles a year. Then there's the Strela plant in Tula. Those workers, that plant was on life support. The workers there were on minimum pay, and now it's advertising for 200 additional positions to help accelerate production of Onyx. But it's important to note here that not all production facilities have gone over to surge wartime level production, which seems interesting, and I take as evidence that there may be limiting factors here beyond just money, because you'd think that the Russian government would be throwing as much money at the problem as necessary in order to get as many missiles as possible, as quickly as possible. If not all plants are going over to rapid production schedules, it means there may be shortages of imported components, or maybe there's a skilled labour issue. And we know that imported components may be an issue. People like to say that import restrictions into Russia will grind the Russian military-industrial complex to a halt because it's reliant on imported components. To an extent, that is true. I think we have to assume two things. One, the Russians have probably stockpiled at least some equipment from before the war, and secondly, they will be at least partially successful in sanction busting, which is they'll find a way to get some foreign components into the country, and in other ways they might find ways to re-engineer their weapons to use the limited amount of domestic components they have available to them. The Iskander missile, for example, uses an American gyroscope. It is possible that Russia has stockpiles of them. It is possible that Russia manages to get their hands on some of them smuggled into the country to maintain production, but clearly it, along with a shortage of skilled labour, is going to be an issue. You can't just get several thousand additional people who are qualified to manufacture rockets and onboard them in a week and a half. And the other issue, of course, is production would need to increase by several thousand%, not 20%, in order to keep up with consumption rates. If we're estimating a Russian production of modern precision weapons at a couple of hundred per year, maybe 120 to 200 Kalibrs, maybe 100 Iskander missiles a year, if we're a little bit generous, plus whatever they can put out for the Onyx, that's enough to maybe support them for 2 weeks, a fortnight of the current missile and rocket attack campaign against Ukraine. Annual production is sufficient to meet the requirements of maybe a couple of weeks. So this is not a case of putting on an extra shift of workers and solving the problem. Inevitably, at the current rate of firing, the Russian military-industrial complex, based on the evidence we have available to us, is not capable of replacing missiles at anywhere near the rate that they and rockets are being fired into Ukraine. So where does that leave us on this question? To me, if we take the best estimates we have on Russian stockpiles and the best estimates we have on Russian usage, then Russia has probably used a majority, but not all of its best systems, unless we were horribly wrong about one of those two assumptions. It's now increasingly, in a way it didn't do in February, March, and April, it's intermixing really old Soviet systems with modern Russian systems in order to make up its strike numbers. The production levels that we're aware of and that we can estimate are very, very, very far short of what would be required in order to refill Russian ordnance requirements. And indeed, we know from what the American production rate of things like Tomahawk is, that it would be a mammoth industrial effort that would strain parts of the US military-industrial complex to rapidly scale up production of Tomahawk to meet the sort of usage requirements and depletion rates that Russia is experiencing. I think we have every reason to believe that given import restrictions, Russian economic conditions, labour force restrictions, etc., Russia simply does not have the capability to scale up to meet its requirements if this war continues to drag on. In short, they would run out of missiles long before they ever ran out of targets. Russia will probably never fully run out of missiles. They would never allow themselves to fully run out of missiles because they want to reserve some in case there's a contingency somewhere else in the world, and of course they'll always have some production rate. But a strike rate of 10 to 30 missiles and rockets per day is completely unsustainable in the medium to long term. They can't do it. You'd be looking instead at a situation where they launch maybe 1 or 2 of these weapons per day at most, or maybe they go a number of days launching none of them, and then launch a collection or a salvo against a critical target at key junctures. There's an even bigger question over whether these strikes are likely to be effective going forward, because as they intermix more and more older weapon systems, the projected effect on each target is going to become less and less. So with all that said, what sort of lessons might be available for other countries to learn, having observed the way the rocket and missile campaigns in Ukraine have progressed so far? I think the first point is we've had confirmed to us yet again just how important ISR is. Intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance continues to be king, because with modern weapon systems, if you can see a target, you can probably hit it, but you cannot hit what you cannot see. Ukraine has been able to hit Russian ammunition depots not just because it has a precision weapon system in the form of HIMARS, but also because it knows that those depots are there, and it knows where HQs and other priority targets are. Ukraine has an ISR advantage. Russia, likewise, can only hit the targets that it's aware of, and it seems that in at least some cases, that has been a problem for Russian forces. There's also increased emphasis on the fact that ISR capabilities need to be properly integrated, and they need to work quickly. They don't just need to be accurate, they need to get information to the right people quickly to authorize timely strikes. It doesn't matter if Russia has been able to identify a warehouse where Ukraine is temporarily keeping Western weapons, if by the time the strike arrives 72 hours later, those weapons are long gone and the weapon impacts an empty building. Politicians and defense departments love investing in kinetic capabilities. Buying more missiles, buying more launch systems, buying more aircraft is always going to be attractive, the big system investment picture. But investing in all these soft intelligence, observation, communication, target acquisition capabilities that sit around, well, that's a key multiplier for how effective those expensive missile systems are going to be. And when you're spending several $1 million every time you pop off a long-distance precision munition, well, you want to make sure you hit something. Because a circular error probable of 5 meters means nothing if your aiming point is the center of a field. And to quote one Ukrainian who emailed me, "I kind of hope the Russians launch a missile at my apartment, because then I can tell the bank that the Russians valued it at several $1 million when I claim insurance." So I do think a lot of countries will be looking at this and asking the question, hey, do we have the ISR capabilities to make sure that when we fire our expensive long-range weapon systems, our intelligence is accurate and we're firing it at a meaningful military target? And the second point is similar to the artillery discussion. It's consumption rates. It's the fact that Russia is burning through expensive precision weapons at a prodigious rate. At the same time, Ukraine entered this war with hundreds of Tochka missiles and has been given large stocks of GLMRS rockets, and they too are burning through those at a prodigious rate. It turns out that when you're at war, there are an awful lot of targets that need to be hit, and a lot of the time a long-range precision weapon is the only mechanism you have to service that target in a timely fashion. Maybe it's behind air defense, maybe it's time sensitive. Either way, often this is your only option. The problem becomes if the enemy has thousands upon thousands of targets that you need to hit in order to degrade his capability, and you only have hundreds of rockets or missiles, then you suddenly run into a problem. We're now going into an era where a number of forces, including, for example, the United States Navy, are looking at improving the capability of their standoff munitions, but at the same time potentially looking at reductions in their total missile stock. Now, I'm sure much smarter people than me are looking at this problem, but I would suggest, looking at this war so far, that there is an argument that you might need more missiles and rockets in a major peer-level conflict than you potentially thought. Modern militaries are incredibly resilient things. They can survive a couple of hits. So the hits need to keep coming continuously day after day after day. And if they can regenerate faster than you can replace your strike capabilities, then eventually you're going to be in a hard place. The third point is around what the capabilities we require for these sort of weapon systems going forward are likely to be. The first is a confirmation that accuracy isn't just technological fetishism. Accuracy is not optional. On the Russian side, the most impactful attacks in a military sense by far have been those precision attacks against storage warehouses, training facilities, command control, and occasionally air defense and airfield targets. And on the Ukrainian side, it's been the HIMARS strikes. It's been pinpoint precision attacks against ammunition depots, against headquarters, command targets, communication facilities, and of course, bridges. Those are not targets that you can easily or readily engage with one or two inaccurate weapon systems. You would need to fire half a dozen or more, whereas you can service them with a relatively small number of precise weapon systems. And to carry on with that point, what we've seen is that inaccuracy can in fact be really, really damaging. Misses have minimal military value. If you don't hit your target, you're probably not actually achieving your goal. And at the same time, depending on where you're firing, those misses can cause significant political blowback. If you are aiming at a train station and you miss by 600 meters and destroy an apartment building instead, then you have achieved nothing in a military sense. You have galvanized the opposing population, and you have helped turn the world ever further against you. Yes, hypothetically, if you fire enough KH-22s at a target in an urban area, eventually, statistically, one of them should probably hit the target. But you're going to do so much collateral damage that I don't see how it could ever be justified from a military or a moral perspective. Moving back to the more mechanical elements, the ability to evade defences is clearly critical. What we've seen is the Ukrainian air defences have become better at shooting down incoming Russian cruise missiles, which means the Russians need to fire larger and larger salvos. And there is a real efficiency and economics problem here. If you need to fire half a dozen missiles at a particular target because it might be defended by anti-air, well, if there's no anti-air there, you've just wasted a whole bunch of missiles that you otherwise wouldn't have had to waste. Systems like HIMARS and systems like Iskander are effective precisely because, among other things, they're able to reliably evade anti-aircraft defences. And then finally, I would observe that both sides would probably benefit from long-range precision weapon systems that enabled them to engage moving targets more easily. America is going in this direction with the latest version of some of its standoff munitions, but there's no evidence that the Russians or the Ukrainians are really there yet, at least in terms of doing this reliably on an ongoing basis. This might not seem like a big issue, but when you consider, for example, the Russian campaign to hunt down the HIMARS systems, which are so often on the run and often have multiple crews so they can continue moving day and night, even if the Russians locate one of these HIMARS systems, unless it stops, there aren't many practical means in the Russian arsenal to engage and destroy that target. But none of those caveats or comments around the requirements for future capabilities or consumption rates should take away from the fact that these missiles and rockets have revealed themselves to be potentially very militarily significant weapons in this war so far. These long-range systems have been effective when used by both sides. Russia has managed to strike some militarily significant targets, and it's also succeeded in pushing a lot of Ukrainian air defense systems around their cities and urban centers to be used for missile defense, rather than allowing them to be pushed up to the front line in order to bully the Russian aerospace forces further back into Russian territory. On the Ukrainian side, even in a heavily contested air environment, weapon systems like HIMARS and M270 and Tochka-U have given the Ukrainians the ability to strike targets in the operational depths despite the strength of the Russian air defense system and the Russian aerospace forces. By all accounts, the destruction of Russian and DPR-LPR ammunition depots and command points had a significant impact on the ability of those Russian and pro-Russian forces to prolong and press their offensives in recent months. So while I think there are caveats as usual around the quality of the data that we've got, the fog of war, etc., that we will not solve until some time after this war is over, the initial findings do seem to suggest that rocket and missile forces do have significant potential in peer or near-peer conflicts, and that there are probably some lessons to be learned here for other powers observing the conflict. So in conclusion, Russia historically placed great importance on its rocket and missile forces, and partly as a result of this, it entered the war with a very large arsenal that included some very modern rocket and missile systems. Russia's initial missile offensive on Ukraine was largely ineffective, but its list of targets has expanded and it has achieved some military successes as time has gone on. We have seen an evolution in Russian tactics towards a decreased use of its modern and precision weapons that we saw overwhelmingly at the start of the war, towards increased employment of older Soviet technology. While claims that Russia has run out of long-range precision weapons are likely false, the increased use of these less precise weapons, coupled with what we know about Russian productive capability and stockpiles going into the conflict, suggests that their current expenditure rates are highly problematic, and they're probably going to have to rely ever more on older systems if the war continues, and they're unwilling to reduce the rate of consumption. I also think there are a variety of lessons that countries can take out of the conflict so far. These range from the very high consumption rates that both sides have experienced and the large number of weapons required, to the success of some specific systems, like, for example, the GMLRS system being used from HIMARS and M270 platforms. But I think the truth of those lessons will only really be borne out in time. Okay, a little bit of a channel update to close out. First thing to say is that the reception to the last video on defense economics I found very, very interesting. In terms of the metrics that YouTube really cares about in terms of view time and click-through rates and views, it was relatively weak. But at the same time, it's probably one of my most liked videos. It has the best like-dislike ratio, it has a whole bunch of comments on it and a lot of patron engagement. So what I take from that is the fact that there's probably a smaller audience out there for content like that, but that audience is really dedicated and really likes that sort of content. So I think I will be able to produce stuff like that in the future. It just can't be the bread and butter, so to speak. It has to be intermixed with other content. Otherwise, YouTube might punish me in the algorithm game. The second thing to say is that the subscriber growth recently has been really heartening in the sense that it hasn't really slowed down over the last couple of months, which continues to astound me. So a genuine thank you for all of you who have hit that button and are now subscribers to the channel. Speaking of subscribers and patrons, I'm doing a bit of a refresh of the Patreon at the moment just to give it a different look and feel, introduce a few new tiers. There are no mechanical benefits or difference between the different tiers, it's just designed to give people more control over the degree to which they support my content going forward, and also to give it a look and feel that better matches the content that I'm doing now. So please go and check it out if you are interested. In terms of subtitles, after the last episode, I've made contact with a couple people who have offered to support in the past. I'm looking at getting the first subtitles rolled out on some older videos this week, and I've got invitations open for anyone else who wants to assist. Once we've got subtitles up for a couple of the historical videos that I've done, then we'll start looking at issues like translation. Finally, a bit of a heads up that I do have some travel planned at the tail end of August. I'm hoping that doesn't impact the upload schedule, but if it does, then I'll try and provide some warning in advance. Thank you again to all of you who support and engage with the channel. I genuinely appreciate it, and I will see you all again soon.